All right, we're back with day three, the final day of our discussion of Machiavelli and his early 16th century masterwork, Il Principe, or The Prince. And uh, we're going to take a close look here at two important chapters, chapter 18 and chapter 25. And of course, these little video sessions that I'm doing here, these are just to guide your readings. And of course, I use these as the basis for the question sets that we've been looking at so far. But you know, do read the entire work. The Prince is gloriously brief and easily to understand and full of great stories and uh, interesting analysis. But for this session, we're going to stick mostly to chapter 18 and 25. So, chapter 18, which is pretty much where we left off in our last session, is titled "How a Prince Should Keep His Word," or in other words, whether or not a prince should be honest. So, we've dealt somewhat straightforwardly thus far with the question of violence. Right, the example of Cesare Borgia should come immediately to mind. Clearly, Machiavelli's position, the realist position, is um, that some amount of violence is always present in the world, but that the judicious use of violence can lead to an overall decrease in violence. So there's a sense here in which the approach to violence that a good prince ought to take, according to Machiavelli, it's a sort of a surgical approach. So if we think about what surgery is, if we think about surgery, if we think about, I mean, even something like chemotherapy or the sort of radiation treatment that we provide cancer patients with. I mean, these are violent acts, right? The act of surgery is a violent act, whether you're removing someone's gallbladder or whether you're removing a limb. If you've seen, in films or, if you've read about um, accounts of, battlefield surgery before the invention of anesthesia. So, if you've seen the opening of the film Dances with Wolves, for example, the kind of horror show that was the surgical tent in a Civil War battlefield. I mean, this is a pretty violent act. If someone catches a bullet in their leg, there's no chance to save the leg. Gangrene's going to set in. And the basic position is if we don't perform the surgery, and the surgery is really more of a euphemism, it's basically an act of butchery. If we don't take this giant cleaver and hew off this limb, and of course, it wasn't just a cleaver, there were these, that's actually where we get the phrase bone saw, sort of jagged one person saw that was needed to get through thicker bones like femurs. Right? These are extremely violent acts, and yet they're violent acts that are undertaken uh, for essentially medical reasons, right? So the idea here is that death is inevitable. The death of this particular body is inevitable, and we have to perform a violent act in order to retain as much health in that body as we can. So Borgia's example is a good one. So it was an unhealthy region, the Romagna, when he arrived. It was an unhealthy region. It was beset by violence and uncertainty and fraud. And so an act of surgery was needed. And it was Dorco who was the instrument of that surgery. And then Borgia finally got rid of the instrument in the symbolic act of cutting him in half and leaving behind the bloody sword. So Machiavelli's view on this is that violence can serve a kind of surgical purpose. There's always going to be violence in the world. However, the level of violence in the world is going to ebb and flow. At times there will be more violence, at times there will be less violence. And so what Machiavelli thinks a good prince ought to be able to do is to create a kind of economy of violence. Right? So we're going to use violence in this very surgical, very pointed, very precise sort of fashion. And in so doing, in initiating this or that particular act of violence, we're going to lower overall levels of violence. So Machiavelli's view on violence is like, listen, politics is it's the name that we give to um, those activities which are essentially violent, a kind of public undertaking of violence. And if you want to play in politics, you've got to be willing to be violent, right? This isn't church. This isn't school. This is a place where violence has a definite role to play. And so if you're going to play this particular game, the game of politics, you need to know how to use it well. And of course, using it well is both a matter of using it cunningly, right? Using it effectively. So both Borgia and Agathocles are examples of those who used violence cunningly and effectively, but it must be used both cunningly on the one hand, and it must be used to produce overall greater levels of well-being. Only Borgia, in the examples that we looked at, only Borgia did that, right? Agathocles, he says we cannot consider him great and honorable. Why? Because even though he used violence very cunningly, he didn't use it to the benefit of all. Okay, so that's the question of violence. Here he has some interesting things to say about what else a prince must be ready to do. So how praiseworthy is it? How praiseworthy it is for a prince to keep his word and to live with integrity and not by cunning. Everyone knows. Nevertheless, one sees from experience in our times that the princes who have accomplished great deeds are those who have thought little about keeping faith and who have known how cunningly to manipulate men's minds. And in the end, they have surpassed those who laid their foundations upon sincerity, right? So from the very beginning, Machiavelli is very clear. Sure, it's great to have a reputation for keeping your word, for being faithful. But ultimately, uh, you got to know, in the same way that you got to know how to use violence effectively, you got to know how to use falsehoods effectively. You got to know how to use lies and deceptions effectively. Now he begins this discussion actually with some interesting reflections. So we're gonna take a close look at these next two paragraphs. Therefore, you must know that there are two modes of fighting: one in accordance with the laws, the other with force. The first is proper to man, the second to beasts. But because the first in many cases is not sufficient, it becomes necessary to have recourse to the second. Therefore, a prince must know how to make good use of the natures of both the beast and the man. So this is a kind of a strange statement. A good prince must understand the methods of both beast and man. We talked a little bit last time about how for Machiavelli, order is in some ways more foundational than law. Only after order was reestablished, in other words, only after obedience to authority was established, could law be reestablished. Law, writing, speech, reason, these are the modes of fighting in accordance with man, right? These are the tools that men use to deal with one another. But oftentimes, law, reason, speech, these are not enough. And when those are not enough, it's a matter of force. Right. So if we think about, for example, the run up to the American Civil War, right? So the American Civil War breaks out in 1861, but it had been on the burner, right, for well over 2 decades. Been a lot of speech. There had been a lot of attempts to convince what would become the Confederate States, the evil of slavery, the untenability of slavery in the long term, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, when speech and law, the legal system, i.e., the judicial system, Congress, the legislative branch in general, when these failed, it came to blows. And so if you want to engage in politics, you got to know both how to use law when necessary and when appropriate to use force. So you have to have both the modes of fighting in accordance with men and with beasts. So there's this kind of duality here. But then in the very next paragraph, we get the second duality. Since then, a prince must know how to make use of the nature of the beast. Sorry, what am I doing here? Since a prince must know how to make use of the nature of the beast, he should choose from among the beasts the fox and the lion. For the lion cannot defend itself from traps, while the fox cannot protect itself from the wolves. It's therefore necessary to be a fox in order to recognize the traps, and a lion in order to frighten the wolves. Those who base their behavior only on the lion do not understand things. So we have this other duality, and of course, he's drawing here from these sort of metaphors that have been common to the Western bestiaries for centuries. These are, if you go back to Aesop, for example, in Aesop, foxes are cunning and lions are powerful, but they both have their weaknesses. The fox tends to be vain. The lion tends to be unable to manage. It tends to be not particularly smart. Let's put it that way. And so a good prince must have both natures. He must be like the fox in that he must be able to scare others. He must present, in other words, a sort of fearsome um, image to others. And he also must be like the fox. He can't just be feared. He can't rule only through strength. He must also rule through cunning. He must also be um, intelligent and conniving enough to recognize traps when they're set for him. So we have this second duality, the lion and the fox. We have to know how to use both strength and force on the one hand. These are the tools of the lion. And we have to know how to use deception and cunning on the other. These are the ways of the fox. This paragraph continues. This is just kind of a reminder of things that we went over last time. A wise ruler, therefore, cannot and should not keep his word when such an observance would be to his disadvantage, and when the reasons that caused him to make a promise are removed. If men were all good, this precept would not be good. But since men are a wicked lot and will not keep their promises to you, you likewise need not keep yours to them. A prince never lacks legitimate reasons to color over his failure to keep his word. If you go a little bit further down here, but it's necessary to know how to color over this nature effectively and to be a great pretender and dissembler, right? Princes must be great pretenders, great dissemblers. Men are so simple-minded and so controlled by their immediate needs that he who deceives will always find someone who will let himself be deceived. So we discussed this last time. Generally, Machiavelli's view and the realist's view is that as far as politics are concerned, people are bad, right? He tells us in chapter 15, there's such a difference between how we ought to behave and how we actually behave, that to pretend that everyone's going to act as they ought to is to just lead yourself inexorably to failure. So this sort of reinforces this view, right, that men are bad and they're always looking to take advantage of you. And because they're always looking to take advantage of you, you must be willing to break your word when it's necessary. But there's this additional idea, which is very interesting. Men are so simple-minded and so controlled by their immediate needs that he who deceives will always find someone who will let himself be deceived. There's a sense for Machiavelli that the prince has to almost sort of know things in a different way. He has to have sort of fundamentally different insights into the nature of the world around him. Most people, Machiavelli thinks, most people, it's not just that they're easily deceived, it's that most people want to be deceived. Most people want to be lied to. They're not that interested in reality. Reality is disappointing. Most people want to be sold something. If we think about the experience of the 20th and 21st century, think about the experience of the interactions of democracy on the one hand and television on the other, right? People, they don't want to do politics. Like voting rates in America are very low, even in presidential cycles. They never get anywhere near 70%. For a while, they actually languished below 50%. In off-year elections, it's very, very low, routinely well below 50%. People don't run for office. People don't attend city council meetings. People don't like politics in general, but they like watching politics on TV. They like watching MSNBC. They like watching Fox News. So even though they don't particularly care about politics, they don't particularly care to be well informed about politics. They like watching the pageantry of it. They like watching the drama. It's a kind of a, if you watch Fox News, right, you get the clear sense that what's happening is a little bit like a WWF or WWE wrestling match, right? So like professional wrestling. You got good guys, you got bad guys, and every single day they're doing something new to each other. People want to be deceived, and a prince has to know that. A prince has to be able and be willing to take advantage of the fact that other people want to be deceived. I do not wish to remain silent about one of these recent examples, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need to get into that. Next paragraph. Therefore, it's not necessary for a prince to possess all of the above mentioned qualities like faith and honor and honesty. It's not necessary for a prince to possess all of the above mentioned quality, all these good qualities, but it is very necessary for him to appear to possess them. Furthermore, I shall dare to assert this, that having them and always observing them is harmful, but appearing to observe them is useful. For instance, to appear merciful, faithful, humane, trustworthy, religious, and to be so, but with his mind disposed in such a way that should it become necessary not to be so, he will be able and know how to change to the opposite. One must understand this, a prince, and especially a new prince, cannot observe all those things for which men are considered good, because in order to maintain the state, he must often act against his faith, against charity, against humanity, and against religion. And so it is necessary that he should have a mind ready to turn itself according to the way the winds of fortune and the changing circumstances command him. And so if you're playing the game of politics, you can't always afford to be honest. You cannot always afford to be good. You cannot always afford to be faithful. Sometimes you have to kill people. Sometimes you have to lie to people. But as far as you can, try to appear to be faithful, honest, good, nonviolent, et cetera, et cetera. It's always good to appear to be these things, even if it's not always good to be these things. Therefore, a prince must be very careful never to let anything fall from his lips that's not imbued with the five qualities mentioned above. To those seeing and hearing him, he should appear to be all mercy, all faithfulness, all integrity, all humanity, and all religion. And there's nothing more necessary than to seem to possess this last quality. Men in general judge more by their eyes than their hands. Everyone can see, but few can feel. This is another, actually, just goes back to something we just said, which is that princes, it's not just that they have to be cunning in ways that normal people don't, they have to have a sort of a different view of the world. If you go back to the very early chapters of The Prince, he often talks about the prince. So, for example, he says if you gain a new principality in which you don't live, right? So if you gain a little bit of territory and you've never been there, he says go there immediately. Don't just send an advisor and don't rely on what the advisor tells you. Go there, get your hands in the dirt, feel what it's like for yourself. But the whole idea being that an advisor sending you letters, calling you on the phone, he can deceive you, right? Words, speech, sights, and sounds. These are things that are easy to deceive people with. But the other senses, the nose and the touch, right? These things it's very difficult to deceive with. And so this is, I mean, obviously this is a metaphor. He's not literally saying that princes have to have a heightened sense of touch or something like that. What he's saying is that princes have to have a different way of seeing the world, different than everyone else, right? Most people just sit at home and watch TV. Those people don't really want to know how things are. They don't really want to know where the bodies are buried. They don't really want to know how the world economy works. They don't really want to know how their stuff gets made. They just sort of want to consume things and be left alone. This is what the prince calls this. This is the mindset, the attitude of what he calls the popolo, which is just the people. Right? Most people just kind of want to be left alone. They want to be comfortable. But there are some people, what he calls the grandi or the great, and the prince is always among the great. They have to have a kind of special way of knowing things, right? They have to be able to see through issues and to see what's really lying underneath. So most people see with their hands, or sorry, most people judge with their eyes and their nose. Oh, sorry, most people judge with their ears and their eyes, and they want to be deceived. But the prince has got to be better than that. He's got to be able to feel things out himself, and he's got to be. He has to know that other people want to be deceived and to take advantage of that fact. Okay, I want to jump ahead to the second to last chapter, which is chapter 25 of Fortune's power in human affairs and how she can be resisted. So, one thing that we haven't discussed yet that we would have discussed if we were in the classroom, and I'm hoping you guys could see this. I'm writing a word here. Okay, so this is the word virtu, which actually in the original Latin would be pronounced virtu. But virtu looks very, very close to our word for virtue, but do not confuse them. The word virtue means right action, right? So a virtuous action is an action that's undertaken in accordance with some moral principle, right? So if it's, if every Sunday you call your mom, right, there's a moral principle here, which is that we ought to honor our parents. And every time you call your mother, that's a virtuous activity. If, you go to church on Sundays, if you participate civically, right, there are civic virtues, there are religious virtues, there are other moral virtues. And anytime you act in accordance with these virtues, that's virtuous activity. This is not that. The word virtu, like this, I really hope you can see this, but I'm not 100% sure that you can. How do I tell if you can see that or not? Let me think. What if I wrote it on? What if I wrote it on? Okay, I'm going to try to write it on the. Okay, I'm going to write it on the. Hopefully you can see that. There's the word virtu right there. I just wrote it on the PDF. And of course, there's a reverse accent on the U there. It's what is that? An accent? It's not the egg U. It's the I forget which accent. It's the opposite of the way it usually goes. So this word virtu is derived from the Latin root here is vir, which is it basically just means man. It's the root of our word virility, for example. If you're a virile person, we only ever really describe men as being virile, and it means that they're still able to reproduce, essentially. It's an interesting concept. It shows up in Machiavelli, and his interpreters have made much of it. And in Machiavelli, what virtue is, it's related to this idea of being a man. It's the idea of manliness. Now, obviously, that's very gendered. The term manliness is very gendered, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So, for example, in the 17th century in England, Machiavelli had a sort of resurgence, especially in the first half of the 17th century. He was being, his works were being reprinted. He was being read. His ideas were coming up a lot in the debates that surrounded the English Civil War of 1640 to 1649. And the way that they interpreted Machiavelli, they were looking for examples of great Machiavellian princes, and they actually looked at someone like Elizabeth, who was Queen of England at the end of the 16th century, as a great example of a manly ruler. Why? Because she had the characteristics of princely virtues that Machiavelli identified um, here in the Prince. So virtue, it means sort of manliness in this sense, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not attached to like having a penis or whatever. If you have certain virtues, if you have certain qualities, then you can be described as someone who exhibits a certain kind of virtue. So what sorts of qualities are these? It's the sorts of qualities that Machiavelli has been identifying, right? Do you have the judgment necessary to perceive what is necessary, given the circumstances? And perhaps more importantly, do you have the wherewithal? Do you have the ability? Do you have the capacity? Do you have the will to take advantage of those circumstances and to see your will be done in the world, right? So, somebody like Borgia, right? Some things were handed to him, but he faced many, many challenges. And what Borgia was particularly good at was identifying what the circumstances called for, identifying the resources that he had at his disposal, both material resources in terms of wealth or power that he had, but also his internal resources. What sort of strengths did he have personally? Identifying the resources that are available to you, identifying what the circumstances call for, and then having the will and the verve and the grit to get the job done. This is all what we mean by virtue. And throughout the Prince, what Machiavelli sets up is a kind of opposition. He sets up an opposition between two forces. On the one hand, you have the forces of virtù, right? The forces of the prince's will, his willingness and his desire to shape the social and political reality to in ways that are satisfying to him, right? So these are the forces of mankind, as it were, and these forces are opposed to this second force, a second force, which is this force, the force of fortune, which goes by the name of Fortuna. So you have these opposing forces of virtù and Fortuna. And for Machiavelli, a good prince is a prince who is able to exert this virtue, who's able to channel, to marshal the forces of his or her internal virtue, and to use them against the cunning and the force of Fortuna. So here's what he has to say about this. I'm not unaware that many have held and do still hold the opinion that the affairs of this world are controlled by fortune and by God, that men cannot control them with their prudence, and that, on the contrary, men can have no remedy whatsoever for them. For this reason, they might judge that it is useless to lose much sweat over such matters and let them be controlled by fate. So, we see this view in a figure like, we'll say at the end of Plato's Republic, for example, the discussion of the regime types and the inevitable cycle of regimes. We see it there. Many Christian thinkers, particularly those who wrote after the publication of Augustine's City of God in the early 5th century, held that whatever it was that was happening on earth, it was the product of God's will, or it was the products of God's not negligence, but God's absence, and therefore it was a process that was controlled by mankind's sort of sinful nature, and that whatever it is that was happening, what really mattered was life after death. That even as the world kind of fell down around your ears, even as the barbarians are at the gate and the Goths are sacking Rome, even as these things are happening, you don't really need to worry about it because none of this stuff can affect your eternal salvation, which after all is determined entirely by whether or not you are justified in the eyes of God. And of course, this justification has nothing to do with whether or not you live in a stable region or whether or not you're a good prince or a bad prince or whether or not you're a good worker or whatever. So, in other words, a lot of previous political theory didn't really emphasize the role that human beings play in managing the outcomes of social and political life. And here Machiavelli is saying, well, what if we tried? This opinion has been held all the more in our own times because of the enormous blah, blah, blah. When I've thought about it, sometimes I'm inclined to a certain degree towards their opinion. Nevertheless, in order not to wipe out our free will, I consider it to be true that fortune is the arbiter of one half of our actions, but that she still leaves the control of the other half, or almost that, to us. And so here he suggests that fortune is definitely part of the story, but that we play an important role in what happens. And in fact, maybe we control about 50% of what happens. I compare her, fortune, to one of those destructive rivers that, when they become enraged, flood the plains, ruin the trees and buildings, raising the earth from one spot and dropping it onto another. Everyone flees before it, everyone yields to its impetus, unable to oppose it in any way. But although rivers are like this, it does not mean that we cannot take precautions with dikes and dams when the weather is calm, so that when they rise up again, either the waters will be channeled off or their force will be neither so damaging nor so out of control. The same things occur where fortune is concerned. She shows her power where there is no well-ordered virtue to resist her, and therefore turns her impetus towards where she knows no dikes and dams have been constructed to hold her in. So notice the metaphor that he uses here is river. So in other words, a kind of a natural destructive force. This is one of the other ways in which Machiavelli is a sort of quintessentially modern figure. So if we think about what's going on in the world in the 16th and 17th centuries, if we think about the particular modern attitude, modern posture that's being developed in these centuries, a very important part of that attitude, a very important part of that posture is the development of science, of natural science. And of course, the development of natural science is not just the development of certain techniques, certain technologies, not just the discovery of certain natural principles, Boyle's law, all this kind of stuff. Science is as much about an attitude or a posture as it is about these other things. So if we think about what science is, science operates under the assumption that the world can be known, and that not only can the world be known, but that the world can be, once known, it can be controlled. To put this the way that Francis Bacon, an English philosopher writing about a century and a half, actually, no, just about a century after Machiavelli, knowledge is power. If you understand how things work, in particular, if you understand things in terms of causation, and ultimately science is only the study of material causes, if you understand things in terms of causation, that means that you can yourself predict. It means that you yourself can influence. You yourself can control causation. And so if you understand, in other words, the fundamentals, the sort of underlying principles that set matter in motion, so if you understand, for example, the principles of fluid mechanics, if you understand the principles of thermodynamics, what it means is that there will come to be a series of circumstances in which you can use that knowledge to influence the course of this or that thermodynamic reaction, this or that fluid mechanic phenomena. Right? So if you want to build a better bridge, if you want to build a fireproof house, then you ought to know how water works and you ought to know how fire works. What Machiavelli is saying is this: in the same way that dikes and dams can help us beat back the forces of nature, Fortuna, who is always ultimately trying to undo and unmake what we've done, If it's the case that dikes and dams and that technologies rooted in this new natural science can help us take control of these things. And remember that about this time, it was about this time that the Dutch had begun to claim back significant parts of what is now the Netherlands, began to claim them back using a series of dikes from the Atlantic Ocean themselves. So it seemed like at this point, the Dutch were beginning to exert their will against something as large and unwieldy as the ocean itself. All right, so if technology rooted in a certain scientific posture can help us control the natural world that wants to undo our plans, that's constantly knocking our houses down. And so if we think about engineering, engineering is our attempt to use knowledge, the knowledge of science to beat back natural effects. Medicine is the attempt for us to use the knowledge of biology to beat back nature's attempts to kill us through disease and old age and parasites and all this kind of stuff. If that's possible, then it might also be possible that if we uncover certain social and political principles of motion, we might be able to control the social and political world as well. And so, what Machiavelli suggests here is a new outlook on politics, an outlook on politics that emphasizes the that emphasizes the need for control. And just as it emphasizes the need for control, it imagines that what politics is about ultimately is control. That the purpose of politics isn't glory, that it isn't the pursuit of the good. What it is the minimization of uncertainty and fear. That's what politics is about. And so Machiavelli, in beginning this new posture towards the political world, politics is about minimizing threats. It's about minimizing uncertainty. And it's about minimizing them through a certain amount of knowledge and control over social and political circumstances. It's here that Machiavelli foresees, as it were, the invention of the primary form of political technology that arises in the course of the next 100 years. And that the name for that primary form of political technology is the state. So on Monday, we will begin our discussion of Hobbes's Leviathan. And in beginning our discussion of Hobbes's Leviathan, we will begin our examination of this new modern technology called the state. All right, guys, that does it for Machiavelli. If you have any questions, email me. Otherwise, keep up with your question sets. Let me know if you have any problems, and we'll talk soon. Bye.